Hi, welcome to Miss Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information will be U.S. Notes 1.8, People on the Margin of Society. It includes information aligned with your first set of information on your study guide. Remember that you're going to control the lecture. Pause when you need to, write down your questions and bring them to class, and rewatch this as often as you need. And of course, always use your study guide to help you take your notes. So let's go ahead and get started. In the previous notes, I've actually covered some of the information I'll be talking about today. However, that does not mean you should skip these notes. I'll give you some new information, and I'll go in more depth in some, and I'll clarify some of the things I've talked about before. So yes, these are important to understanding many of the groups we're examining in the unit, and you need to watch them. I want to start with explaining some terms. First, people on the margins. What do I mean by this? These are the groups of people who were marginalized by society, people who were not part of mainstream America. These are groups that face prejudice, discrimination, and obstacles that other groups did not face. In this unit, we're talking about African Americans, women, children, and immigrants as members of the overall group, people on the margins. The second term I want to clarify is disenfranchised. The people and groups I'm going to talk about in this section of notes were all disenfranchised from society. This means that they had no buy-in. They felt like they were not part of society and they were not gaining anything from being a part of American society. When a person feels disenfranchised, they feel they've been treated unfairly by others and that they don't belong, that they're not welcome in society. All of these groups were disenfranchised by society in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So now that you know the terms, let's talk about African Americans. I've already mentioned the reasons African Americans had for moving to the cities. They were looking for new chances away from their history as slaves and less discrimination. For them, however, moving did not bring much change. This is the group that was easiest to visually identify as a minority group, meaning it was easy to discriminate against them. Even with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments following the Civil War, life was not fair or equal for Black Americans. Now, just to review, the 13th Amendment ended slavery, the 14th gave all former slaves full citizenship, and the 15th gave them voting rights. Though these amendments should have protected African Americans and their rights, they didn't. Yes, slavery ended, but with the lack of education allowed to slaves, all freed slaves had no real choice in jobs and movement. They owned nothing, no house, no money, no clothing, and most were illiterate due to laws outlawing the teaching of reading to slaves. This kept many African Americans tied to the same land, doing the same job they had always done. And now they had to sharecrop, which meant they had to pay the landowner, who was usually their former owner. As far as voting, laws were created mainly in the South, but not only there, to keep African Americans from voting and impacting the way the towns and states were run. These laws, known as Jim Crow laws, were designed to specifically target blacks and poor whites who would vote to change the status quo. Examples of these include grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and poll taxes. Under the grandfather clause, if your grandfather had voted, you were exempt from the rest of the law. This meant no black, whose grandfather would have been a slave, could be exempt. However, many whites were. African Americans were then made to take a literacy test. This test had little to do with the ability to read and a lot to do with random, trivial knowledge. It was also graded by the poll worker, who, as you have just guessed, I'm sure, was always white and prejudiced. Finally, if a person was able to pass the literacy test, then they had to pay a poll tax. This meant that they actually had to pay to vote. This kept the poor from voting, allowing those already in power to retain power and to keep African Americans, and really any minority group, from changing the status quo and changing society. This kept African Americans on the margins. Women were also a group that was disenfranchised and on the margins of society. Women lacked the rights men had. Their money actually belonged to their father, their husband, or their brother, and in many states they could not even own property. And, of course, they could not vote. As women saw more and more issues surface, they began to look for ways to change society. Many of the early issues women wanted to fix were not political, but were actually social. Women were a driving force to end child labor, and to bring about changes in schooling and protection of children. They also wanted to focus on family issues and, as a result, temperance, or the banning of alcohol. Women and some men saw alcohol as the root of many of society's problems. If they could eliminate alcohol from society, they could eliminate domestic abuse, wasteful spending by husbands, and improve family life for women and children. Eventually, this led to a push to gain the vote for women, called suffrage, in order to get the other agenda items accomplished. Immigrants also lived on the margins of society. They were treated poorly due to their different looks, clothing, language, religion, and customs. And these individuals came to America looking for a better life, and all they seemed to find was hardship. They often felt they had no support of the government, society, or business owners. This led to disenfranchisement in the current system, causing many immigrants to support groups that seemed to help them: labor unions, radical political groups, and political machines. While these groups may have helped gain some rights for immigrants, in many ways the involvement in the groups that most Americans feared and looked down upon further alienated the immigrants from mainstream society. So this is the end of U.S. Notes 1.8. I hope you learned something from our 5-minute lecture. I'll see you in class with any of the questions that you have.